the same kind of policies that people criticize Stalin for at the utmost is not a requirement of communism. It's not ideological. It's something that's based off of material conditions, and like we're certainly living in a different material condition.
100%. Hello.
Hey, welcome to Left Unread.
My name's Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're simply two elected representatives of a large national syndicate. That's not a party. And,
this episode we have read Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend by Domenico Losurdo. And if you're not a regular listener, we've split this book into two parts. For this episode, we have read through chapter 4.
Yes. Yeah, this one comes from Iskra Books. Shout-outs, they published it. I know that one of our go-to publishers, Verso, has a big beef with this book and refuses to publish it.
Really?
Yeah, actually, I think it was last year, but they did an April Fool's joke where they posted, like, the time has finally come, we're doing Domenico Losurdo's Stalin, and I sent it to you because I was like, oh, hell yeah, and then I found out that I got trolled. I got trolled on the internet.
That has totally slipped my mind. I didn't remember that at all.
Yeah. Domenico Losurdo, though, he was a lifelong communist, Italian historian, and philosopher, and has written numerous works in defense of the tradition of scientific socialism. Until his death in 2018, Losurdo had published critical essays ranging from a historical critique of liberalism to Western Marxist revisionism to maybe his most notorious work, a radical reevaluation of the Stalin era of the USSR. And that's what we read today.
Yeah. I will say, as a quick note, in the foreword, they mentioned two other books that do both now officially have English translations, that both of which sound like things that I would like to read. I was looking them up on Thrift Books today. Western Marxism, How It Was Born, How It Died, How It Can Be Reborn, and The Question of Communism, History and Future of an Idea. I'm really interested in both of them. Yeah,
I know in 2024 or 2025, I think his last work was just published about Western Marxism versus Eastern Marxism. I'm curious if it's the same one mentioned there. I know that his liberalism book is pretty well lauded. I'd be interested in reading either of those, honestly.
Yeah, I saw that.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so I think before we jump into the chapters, it's an interesting question to ask, why read this book? I have an answer, but do you want to start?
Take us away, Aaron.
I think anybody that's coming into reading communist literature, you have to contend with the figure of Stalin. You have to contend with the fact that, frankly, figure out how to reframe and recontextualize who is probably the most propagandized figure in all of history. And it's really interesting to me to see how someone goes from number one Nazi killer to Russia's Hitler in their lifetime in the way that they are spoken about and written about, and especially posthumously. And so I would really like to try to get a more complete picture of the realities of what was going on in the USSR to make a stronger assessment of who Stalin was as a leader and as a communist. I think something that comes up in this book that is a good encapsulation of kind of how I've thought about the USSR in the past is thinking of it as a state of exception. Yeah. The idea, that every decision made under Lenin and under Stalin, those are decisions made under great duress. And so it's really hard to judge the goodliness of a decision when you're making a decision in the midst of a civil war while also fighting off capitalist encirclement, while also trying to recover from a revolution, while also preparing for a world war after recovering from a world war. You know what I mean? It's So I really kind of just wanted more context around that. I know that I have holes in my history, and the history that I know of the USSR is largely the U.S. propagandized version, approved by the CIA version of Stalin. So I wanted another view.
Yeah, I think that you've spoken perfectly most of the reasons that I was interested in reading this, and it's because I think that socialism actually exists. There is actually existing socialism. That's really it. I can't discount those, and the USSR is a huge part of that. Even if you only consider it to be a great experiment in the history of society or whatever, the fact remains that for that 60, 70, 80 years, the USSR was really trying to build socialism. I mean, that's something that was really shattering early on in my just conception. And I was talking to a friend and he said, when they opened the archives, they just found a bunch of people really earnestly trying to make society better. You can read the minutes, you can read the transcripts, you can read the arguments, and you can see that there were people that were genuinely trying to create a society that was for the better, a better future.
And frankly, they objectively did. I mean, I've said some version of this on the show before, and I'll pull a quote from the book, but they went from peasants to astronauts in one man's lifetime. Like, that's not for nothing. There's this great quote. I don't want to jump all the way around in the book, but I do want to read this quote on 139. It is not only the rising standard of living that motivated such enthusiasm for Stalin and his regime, so to speak. There is much more. There is the real development of hitherto marginalized nations, the achievement by women of legal equality with men, accompanied by an improvement in their social status, the emergence of a solid system of social protection involving pensions, medical care, protection of pregnant women, family allowances, the considerable development of education and of the intellectual sphere as a whole, with the extension of a network of libraries and reading rooms and the spread of the taste for the arts, for poetry. It was the tumultuous advent and exalting of modernity, urbanization, the nuclear family, social mobility. It's just like unquestionable that the quality of life was objectively better for folks. And I'm not going to go on a whole list of apologetics saying that I think that Stalin made every correct decision.
Yeah.
Certainly not, but that's why we need to contend with him as a figure.
Right. Those things simply can't be ignored. And
exactly.
I think that, hell yeah. I mean, that's the thing is like they shot for the stars and they landed somewhere. And I think to have another view on the USSR having to do with something like degeneration or a new elite bureaucracy or whatever is really kind of just missing the point. It's missing the point of what actually happened.
Yep.
Right? And it's, again, like we didn't read this to forgive Stalin. We read it to contextualize Stalin. Okay?
Yeah, that's fair.
There are still things that obviously I think that Stalin did that are crazy bad. But if the only thing you know about Stalin and the Stalin era and terror in the Soviet Union and totalitarianism, authoritarianism, or whatever is coming from the shit that you've read in your history textbook, then you're missing so much of the picture. And to be fully transparent, this was not the only book I read for this. I mean, I read also Soviet State and Society Between Revolutions by Louis H. Siegelbaum, which is from fucking Cambridge, so don't talk to me about bias there.
Yeah.
I read Robert Thurston's Life and Terror in Stalin's Russia from 1931 to 1941, which had largely to do with the idea of terror.
Terror.
It's literally referenced in this book, by the way. He literally cites that study. And that was in 92. Okay, I've read a bunch, and I still have to read Conversations with Stalin by, I think it's Milovan Diljas. Pardon my Serbo-Croat pronunciation there. But I still have stuff to read about Stalin, especially late in his life.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've just really wanted to know because it's just so much of a blind spot. How does Soviet society actually work? How is the Soviet society actually structured? What actually happened in Soviet society in those eras? The eras that we think of looking back at it now is something that's like crazy and totalitarian and Hitleristic. I mean, I think that's just something that needs to be remedied. And so I was really glad to read this, especially because it was written in like 2019. This was from 2018.
2008. Originally published in Italian in 2008.
Yeah, 2008. So it was a very refreshing look. I have thoroughly enjoyed this section so far.
Yeah, same. There's another quote I'll throw out from the front matter just to throw it out. It's on page 15 if you want to know. XV. One may remain critical of, if not inimical to Stalin or what he stood for, but that need not translate into yielding even more to ruling class ideology and denying the struggles for a better society and the consequent impressive and lasting achievements of millions of people under Stalin's formal leadership in the USSR. I think that says it quite well.
Yeah.
So in that case, I think it makes sense for us to just kind of go chapter by chapter.
Yeah.
Since we've broken this one up, we're going to be going through, we can go through the introduction in chapter 1 together, maybe, if you want.
Sure.
I will say one thing that's funny is Losurdo often quotes other historians that he makes often a joke about how they are not sympathetic to Stalin in any way.
Right.
I don't know if this is the case with this figure, but this is from Thomas Mann. But this quote on page 5, to place Russian communism and Nazi fascism on the same moral plane in that both would be totalitarian is superficial at best, fascism at worst. Whoever insists on this equation may well consider himself a Democrat. In truth and in the bottom of his heart, he is in fact already a fascist. And certainly only in a hypocritical and insincere way will he fight fascism while reserving all his hatred for communism. And that just rang too fucking true for me right now.
Yeah, what a way to start it, huh?
Yeah.
See, this is the problem with I do want to talk about the dual narrative, right, between Stalin and Hitler, but I think that so much of it is going to come up in the next part.
Yeah, there's another whole chapter dedicated to that.
I simply know that's the case. I mean, he points to figures like Arendt here and how she talks a lot about totalitarianism and whatnot. And I think that that's something that's just, it's ever present in the discussion around Stalin. And I don't know, it's just curious. I think Losurdo does a lot, and we'll get to it in the later chapters, just to do that kind of comparison. I think one of the most fascinating questions when it comes to that comparison between Hitler and Stalin that we can address here, like when he's talking about comparing the Gulag and the concentration camps, he says, why limit it at the two? Why stop there? What's actually the purpose of holding those two ideals next to each other and only those two?
Mm-hmm.
You know, when so many humongous injustices have happened throughout history all around the world that we kind of just hand wave away in the midst of this conversation because we're so focused, or not we, but, you know, we're so focused on comparing Hitler and Stalin specifically. You know, it's like, what are you actually doing there? And so, I don't know, that's really the most prevalent thing. I mean, just like we talked about in the last episode, how it's laughable to hold those two things on the same plane in 1938 even.
Yeah.
It's just very true.
Yeah. I had another one at the bottom of that page, but it's a good summation of this idea of the USSR as a state of exception, and maybe it's worthwhile to bring that up early on, because that was probably one of the more eye-opening frameworks for this text for me. I knew that there was shit going down in the USSR that obviously, the way I would have characterized it previously was like, put leaders like Lenin and Stalin between a rock and a hard place. There's no good decision to be made.
Yeah.
There's only the best bad decision. And I've come away with this feeling more strongly in that as an attitude, and less that it's fair to make moral judgments against a lot of those decisions, given the duress that they were under. And I think there's a quote on page 5 that starts to paint that picture, and it's going to come up a lot for me as we're talking through the other chapters. At the very bottom, in order to formulate a correct judgment on the Soviet Union, it was necessary not to lose sight of an essential fact. Its leaders came to power in a country accustomed only to bloody tyranny, and were forced to govern in a situation characterized by a more or less permanent state of siege and by a potential or ongoing war. And like the idea of all of the things, just try to contextualize for a moment, listener, all of the shit that was going down in Russia at the time of the October Revolution and then in the subsequent years afterward. They're obviously rebuilding after World War I. They're dealing with the revolutions that have occurred in the country. There's civil wars that break up. 3 get mentioned in these first 4 chapters. There are party schisms immediately with calls for coups and assassinations abound.
Peasant republics, uprisings, the whole nine.
Army defectors. There's the threat of imminent war, which is changing the way that they're dealing with arms and food production. There's an increase in crime. All of this shit happening all at once.
Yeah.
Like Stalin, the quote that has stuck with me since we read that Stalin essay was like that he felt sometimes between two fires. And that's an understatement.
Yeah.
Losurdo
refers to it as the Second 30 Years' War, from 1914 to 1945, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's hardly an understatement. I mean, especially when you're looking at some of the concrete evidence that Losurdo brings up in here. In the 20s, it's easy to excuse. There's literally civil war. You know, there's literally foreign intervention by the Entente. There's all sorts of things. There's uprisings, rebellions, the whole nine. Even in the 30s, though, where you may think that they had some kind of stability, or, right, that's the era where Stalin was centralizing all his power. And it's because people like Trotsky were saying, we're going to do a fucking civil war and overthrow you, you degenerate.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like, you know, when you actually read some of the stuff that they were reacting to, it's hard not to feel kind of the same way. It's not like they have the same hindsight that we do.
So that's the sort of framework that's permeating my entire reading of this text so far. I think that that's intentional on Losurdo's part, certainly. But
one other thing I want to mention from the introduction here, though, is that there is a thread throughout this first half that I think Losurdo talks about, and it has to do with the nation, kind of the idea of the nation as on its own. I'll just start with this quote on page 8. It is this superpower that is to be isolated and is pressured to proceed to an increasingly radical de-Stalinization until it is deprived of any form of identity and self-esteem and is resigned to capitulation and final dissolution. This is just the start of this thought, because it comes back again and again when he's talking about why the Soviets maybe were unable to invade Poland successfully, maybe to liberate Poland, I shouldn't use that language, right? Or why the Soviets were able to withstand the Nazi invasion to such an extent. I think that there's a really interesting wrapping up of that in the national identity. And I think it has to do with Stalin's special interest, you know, the fact that he does have a focus in linguistics and has these ideas about what the nation actually means, what a language and a language group can actually entail.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's really wrapped up into not only what Stalin is writing about the idea of a nation and the role of a nation in the development of socialism, but also other leaders like Mao. When Losurdo is talking about the relationship between proletarian internationalism and the national question, he quotes Mao, and Mao says that to look at internationalism without the nation in mind is to not understand internationalism at all. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's something really interesting there, and I'm sure that this will come back, because it has also to do with a chasm that Losurdo describes between what the absolute ideal is and what the concrete reality is. And I think that that's just something that is super evident throughout these first 4 chapters, I think.
Yeah, big time. And you know that the national question has been something that we've been wrestling with a lot and discussing a lot.
It's only become more of an interesting question as time progresses. You know, there is a historic role of nationalism in the development of society as a whole. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to look back on that development then and compare it to the status we're in now. You know, I remember I think maybe it was either the last episode or the episode before, where I said that, you know, ultimately we're talking about the development of nations, you know, and I know that compared to the ideal, that sounds conservative. But I think what I meant then and what I still mean now is that to ignore there actually is a quote in here about that, where he says to ignore the possibility of revolution within a definite national condition in favor of some abstract, you know, internationalism is to totally miss the point. Yeah, on 107, he says, "But was not the rediscovery of the nation a betrayal of internationalism? It is by no means synonymous with internationalism to lose sight of the fact that the concrete possibilities of the tasks of revolutionary transformation are to be found in the first place on a definite national terrain."
Yep.
You know, and I think, especially in the context of historical development, I think that nationalism still poses an interesting question.
I am uncomfortable in the fact that I am coming to agree with that. I think, to speak broadly about Russia, you wonder how successfully they could have withstood the defense against Germany had they not had a national identity that was uniting them in a national duty to protect the, quote, the fatherland.
Yeah.
That seems so silly, and it's certainly not something in 100, 200 years in the future I would want to maintain, but like I think that there is a concrete benefit to it in time, especially in times of great duress.
Yeah,
it's a uniting factor.
Yeah, and it's also rolled up in the popularity of Stalin. You know, the population's willingness to reinforce his regime, so to speak, is due to the gains that they've made. You know, the defense of those gains is part of what the defense of the Soviet Union was against the Nazis, because they saw this as an imperialist invasion, you know, one that was meant to colonize them, mm-hmm. you know. And I think that, I mean, not only does that come up here in terms of like a national identity, but even in the question about comparing the Gulag and the concentration camps, where they're saying that there's just a literal difference in what the purpose of this idea was between these two poles, right, Hitlerism and Stalinism. It's the difference between like a national identity, rehabilitating the national identity even, in the same way that they're talking about rehabilitating prisoners as comrades and citizens, comparing that to like the kind of Hitlerite expansionist Lebensraum ideology, you know, literally with colonies and slaves in mind.
Yep.
It's totally different. It's totally different.
Yeah, the whole bit where he gets into the gulags later in chapter 4, I think it is, it just begs the question about what is the purpose of internment. And you hit the nail on the head with the distinction between internment in a gulag and internment in a concentration camp.
Yeah.
One is a master-slave situation. One is a reformatory situation. I mean, re-education maybe has a negative connotation now, but the whole point is that someone could leave the gulag, and it was important to Stalin that they get full suffrage back. They get called comrades. They are reintegrated as full members of society. Even former defectors, even people that had betrayed the party previously, they serve their sentence, they do their whatever they're going to do, they come back and they are welcomed with open arms. It's very Maoist.
I was just about to say, echoes of when we read quotations from the chairman, where he says, you know, it's to bring them back again and again until there's nothing left for them except for the barest reaction. Especially in the context of the fucking 40s, right? When we're talking about the worst conditions of the Gulag. Because I'm not saying the Gulag was a handy-dandy time, although there are some very funny examples here.
Yeah, he definitely paints a picture that at first to try to lead you into that.
But that's the thing that you have to understand, is that, like, yes, the Gulag system was awful at the time of the war especially, but it's because it was wartime, you know? When they're prioritizing food distribution... I'll leave it there. Yeah, we'll get there.
Okay, so chapter 1, I guess.
To cast a god into hell.
Yeah, the Khrushchev report. I mean, the secret speech is one of those well-known things. to communists, I guess. I frankly, I don't have a whole lot of comments about it.
I think that the thing with the Khrushchev speech is that there's some context around it, That's going to be a frequent refrain in this episode. But it's that, when Stalin died, it wasn't evident that Khrushchev was going to be the leader. And one interpretation of the secret speech is that with, one fell swoop, Khrushchev is essentially apologizing for all of the crimes at once. And he's doing that with the denunciation of Stalin as a whole. They're moving away from the ideal of terror, which, as Losurdo points out, Stalin was already in favor of doing in many ways. And I think that it's just one cleave, you know what I mean? And I think that, since Stalin's dead, there's actually a quote on page 14. There was a bitter political struggle going on in the USSR and in the socialist camp, and the caricatured portrait of Stalin served excellently to delegitimize the Stalinists, who might overshadow the new leader. The, quote, cult of personality, unquote, which until that moment had raged, did not allow more nuanced judgments. It was necessary to cast a god into hell.
Yep.
So it's that rolling up. Everything we were just doing, we're now going to make a change. Here's our signal to make a change, not only to internally, but it is a secret speech, but also in the political change to the rest of the world. I've spoken a little bit about the post-Stalin leaders' foreign policy choices and how they have some interesting ideas. But I think it's the same thing that Losurdo is trying to point out with Stalin. A continued attempt to move out of that state of exception when surrounded in a clearly hostile world. And I think that I'm not giving Khrushchev credit here because I think he's a dullard.
Yeah, fuck Khrushchev.
Yeah, I think he's trying to do the same thing, and he's doing it with the denunciation of Stalin.
Yeah.
As this kind of central motif.
I'm interested to talk about the cult of personality thing a little bit because I do think there are a couple of quotes in this chapter that are worth bringing up.
Yeah.
Before, though, I want to take the first of many opportunities to shit on Trotsky. Because this quote that we get from Trotsky right under that, where he's talking about Stalin, Trotsky says that Stalin regularly gave proof of incompetence in the political, military, and ideological spheres, who never managed to overcome his, quote, peasant coarseness. And then later is saying of Stalin after Lenin's death, Trotsky accused or suspected Stalin of having hastened Lenin's death due to the former's, quote, Mongolian ferocity. Trotsky is a fucking classist and a racist. What do you know?
Yeah. I don't have this quote on hand right now, but there's a very funny quote later where Losurdo says, Trotsky really came to Bolshevism late in life. Stalin was growing alongside it, know? And I think that there is really something there.
But anyway, about the cult of personality thing. He gets to this a little bit later in the chapter. It looks like starting on around page 34. And it was something that you had sort of brought up in the last episode, I want to say, and I thought it might be interesting. So the question that Losurdo poses here in this section, the cult of personality in Russia from Kerensky to Stalin, he asks, are we dealing with the vanity and narcissism of a single political leader or with a more general phenomenon rooted in a specific objective context? This idea of this development of the cult of personality. It's also worth mentioning that that's where we get dictator President Wilson.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic quote. Just to read it, Bukharin visits the U.S. and writes, in order for the state machine to be better prepared for military tasks, it transforms itself into a military organization, at whose command there is a dictator. This dictator is President Wilson. He has been granted exceptional powers. He has almost absolute power, and attempts are made to install in the people servile feelings for the great president, as in ancient Byzantium, where they had deified their monarch.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up the cult of personality thing I was thinking about. We get this quote on 36 from Stalin, actually. So, as you can see, it doesn't make much sense to attribute to Stalin's narcissism, as Khrushchev does, the exalted form that the cult of personality takes in the USSR from a certain point onwards. In fact, when Kaganovich proposes to him to replace the term Marxist-Leninism with that of Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, the leader to whom such homage is addressed responds, how can you compare a dick to a watchtower? It's just great.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. But, I mean, there is really something to be said. What I had expressed on the last episode was that I felt that maybe the cult of personality was a side effect of attempts to centralize power from a top-down perspective. And it's just interesting to look at the other historical examples given here. I mean, even Kerensky specifically, because he was just the president in the interim government, essentially, before the October Revolution, and even he was like, yeah, I'm the guy, It's actually really funny reading about it because he was dog shit. He was awful. There's a point where I think it was the Kornilov affair, which is like a coup essentially by a dictator this is unimportant.
Sounds like a James Bond novel.
I know. He essentially writes to Kornilov and says, like, if you wanted to coup me and take power, maybe it could work out. Like, he was a shithead. He was in shambles. You know, it's very funny to learn from here that he went on to become the leader of the Menshevik Party.
Yeah.
Because he seemed kind of feckless when I read about him in October, which is not a Stalinist book by any means.
Yeah.
By any means.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a lot of the context. I haven't done the other reading that you have done, and as I've stated many times previously, I have like dog shit memory, and so even what I've learned of history, most of it is in one ear out the other. Mm-hmm. But the kind of takeaway about the cult of personality around Stalin that I'm getting from these chapters here is much more that it's less a top-down dictate kind of thing, and at worst, adopted by necessity in a pre-war and through-war attitude of unification, but largely coming from, I would say bottom up.
Yeah, I was just about to say is that it's really just a question of, like, to what extent was it created by Stalin, you know, or even the people around Stalin. Obviously, in terms of propaganda, Stalin's image was propped up in a lot of ways.
Sure.
In what ways, I'm curious, was that adopted by the masses? The portraits is the classic example, right? I don't know if it was state mandated, but I'm sure it was, to have those portraits hanging around. It's just really interesting how resonant Stalin was to the lower classes of people. And I'm sure that has a lot to do with their rising standards of living, you know, their process of radical emancipation, as Losurdo says, even as it's interwoven with ferocious oppression. It is just a really interesting question. How bottom up really is the cult of personality?
Yeah.
I think it's just something to keep in mind, especially because it's such a pointed thing when it's used in the modern context to say that, like, Stalin created this cult of personality to rule with an iron fist, or Mao boosted his images with a cult of personality, this and that. And it's interesting because you can see attempts at that, like after Mao dies, Hua Guofeng tries to do the same thing. Lots of propaganda posters, lots of really funny songs that are meant to show his image as like the next great chairman or whatever, and it fails, you know? There's an interesting question as to why doesn't it work out in the same way, you know? And it's maybe because he wasn't very good, you know, compared to Stalin, a guy who over 30 years transformed the Soviet Union from a country of a bunch of peasants into another superpower. Maybe there is a bit of a reason behind that one.
He is him, yes.
Yeah, beast mode, I'm afraid. Like, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair.
Now, there is one thing I want to say, though, because there is something here in Chapter 1 still that we kind of skipped past. Damn, I missed my chance to bring this up, because I should have when we were talking about Dictator Wilson. But a crazy fact to me, which I'm sure I have learned before but didn't realize until now, is that the Japanese internment was via executive order. If you want to talk about expulsions by a dictator, I mean, there you go. You know, and I think that Losurdo does a lot of work to talk about the expulsions here, because that is something I expressed in a previous episode, is that a lot of the ethnic deportations don't sit well with me for obvious reasons.
Sure.
But Losurdo does some work to put it into context on pages 29 and 30.
Yep.
I don't really want to talk about the idea of a fifth column, because I think that it feels racist. That's really pretty much it. All the Japanese in America, obviously they're a potential fifth column. You know, all of the Chechens in Russia, obviously I don't fuck with that. That sucks.
Yeah.
Obviously. But it's interesting to look at the context of expulsions in the rest of the world at the time, right? I mean, think about the Nakba in 48, right? We're talking about the creation of Israel. That was literally a product of expulsion and ethnic cleansing.
Yep.
Right? If you want to talk about the jewel of the British Empire, the partition between India and Pakistan, which was maybe like one of the most violent events done by a peaceful government in history.
Heavy air quotes, yeah.
Yeah. Really crazy shit there. And he talks about the expulsion of all Han residents in Tibet.
Yeah.
You know? Like, the idea of expulsions are not something that is central or exclusive to Stalin, I should say.
Yeah, I will say, when we texted about this a little bit, like, they did it too isn't really a sufficient defense, in my opinion,
I agree.
Of a morally impermissible action. But it is important to contextualize what was happening in the USSR around what else was happening internationally. And it's important to contextualize the way those actions are spoken about in history after the fact. We hear all about the mass deportations and ethnic deportations in the USSR. Why aren't we hearing about them elsewhere, you know?
Yeah.
And it's not an apology for the action of Stalin in that case, but it is a contextualization of the decision.
Right. And I think that Losurdo really brings up a great example because it's one that's quite uncomfortable on page 31, and it's having to do with the relocation of Germans after World War II.
Yep.
You know, even Churchill, which not a glowing figure, obviously. I'm not putting Churchill on the pedestal, but he says that expulsion is the method which, so far as we've been able to see, will be the most satisfactory and lasting. Okay, and that was in 44. But, like, to think about people that are, you know, and I don't know to what extent this is people that relocated from Germany post Lebensraum expansion, or people that are just ethnically German living in those areas, but many, many, many Germans were forcibly expelled from their home post World War II.
Yeah.
And it goes without being said, I should say. It's not something that is told in modern history. You know, because we say, those are fucking Nazis, fuck those guys. There's even an example later where he says that, like, out of 143 German prisoners, like, 137 of them had their testicles obliterated.
It's 137 out of 139.
Yeah, right? They're Nazis, right?
Yeah.
But that's fucking crazy, right? If you want to talk about barbarity, there it is.
Yeah, I feel obliged to just throw a couple of quotes out around the deportations from these pages. So I'm just going to kind of
Yeah, by all means.
wing-ding real quick.
Sure.
From 29, starting with Tsarist Russia, which, although allied with the liberal West during the First World War, experienced a wave of deportations of unknown dimensions in Europe involving about 1 million people, mainly of Jewish or Germanic origin. Your aforementioned note of Tibet. In July 1949, all of the Han residents of different generations in Lhasa had been expelled from Tibet in order to counter the possibility of fifth column activity, as well as make the demographic composition more homogeneous. Mm-hmm. The alarm bells of racism should be ringing.
Whoa!
We are dealing with a practice not only implemented in the most diverse geographic and political cultural areas, but in those decades also explicitly advocated for and theorized by important figures. Further down, some 16.5 million Germans were forced to leave their homes, and 2.5 million did not survive the gigantic ethnic cleansing of counter-cleansing operation. And then, it just goes on. I guess I could keep going. Yeah. It was the British government that from 1942 pushed for a general transfer of population from the East German territories. And then, I'll close with this one. In the end, there was virtually no difference between non-communist and communist politicians on the issue of the expulsions of Germans in post-war Czechoslovakia or Poland.
Yeah, and I think that the critical thing here, and again, I'm not excusing expulsions, that's not the point, but, like, just contrast the Western attitude and Stalin's attitude. I'm looking at 31 and 32. Jan Masaryk, which is the son of the founding father of Czechoslovakia, okay, and he was an important foreign minister during World War II, expressed the conviction that, quote, the German possesses no soul, and the words that he understands best are the salvos of a machine gun, right? To compare that to Stalin's attitude on page 33, Stalin's attitude is quite different. Immediately after the unleashing of Barbarossa, they were literally invaded by Germans. He declares that the Soviet resistance can count on the support of, quote, all the best men in Germany, and even, quote, the German people, which is enslaved by the Hitlerite misrulers. Yeah. You know, and it's like, it just becomes more and more clear Stalin's actual attitude towards ethnic minorities in general. I mean, yeah, I still think we should read the national question from him at some point. I don't know how soon after this, but I think it's something that is worthwhile.
There's more Stalin on the table for sure.
Yeah.
And a quote directly from Stalin from 33, right under what you read. The strength of the Red Army lies, finally, in the fact that it does not and cannot feel racial hatred for other peoples, including the German people. Yeah. It's explicitly anti-racist in that attitude, anti-xenophobic, whatever you want to say.
Yeah. There's a really fucking funny quote where they say that the USSR is the first affirmative action empire, which, you know, hell yeah. I mean, fucking sick as fuck. I mean, you know, and they do even more. Oh my God. I think we should come back to maybe the comparison to the current state of affairs in the U.S. vis-a-vis the exploitation of workers in slavery later when we're talking about the gulag.
Prisons.
Yeah. But, you know, there's also that comparison there, right? We did a literal final solution against our native population. We're still reaping the rewards of that today. So,
yeah. I only have one other thing really from chapter 1. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's going to come up if you're ever up for torture and decide to start debating someone on the internet about Stalin, they're going to bring up the non-aggression pact with Germany. And there is a lot of contextualization of that throughout these chapters, which starts in chapter 1. On page 15, first, I would note the documents from the Russian archives show that at least in the 2 years immediately preceding the aggression of the Third Reich, Stalin was literally obsessed with the problem of the quantitative increase and the qualitative improvement of the entire military apparatus. The idea of the non-aggression pact was merely an acknowledgement of recognizing he was the USSR was in a position of technological inferiority. They did not have the technology, they did not have the numbers. And so he made a decision that a lot of people tout as somehow being in league with Hitler,
Yeah.
which was basically biding his time, giving him an opportunity to ramp up production, which came with its own banes. That's a decision that was not easily made and was not easily borne on the people of the USSR. But I do think it's important to start contextualizing that here.
Even to think again of that question, why limit the comparison to just Hitler and Stalin? What about all the other non-aggression pacts that Europe had with Germany before the war? Why don't we look at those in the same way, right? I mean, France, England. Yeah, plenty.
Yeah.
All of those non-aggression pacts were violated by Hitler. And then again, why do we look at Molotov-Ribbentrop and say it's the ultimate betrayal? I know that partially, just to put it out there, the Baltics, Poland, that's part of it.
Yeah.
But still.
Yeah, and there's some interesting context that I didn't really know, which was around largely Britain kind of goading Russia, trying to get them to engage, deliberately manipulating international politics in a way to try to get Russia to engage. And so, I don't know, I would say kudos to Stalin for not taking the bait and getting his ducks in a row.
There's a point where Losurdo even hints at the idea that Stalin's mispreparation, perhaps on the front, could have been a trap, to bring all the German forces in one crazy push because they thought they could do it. I don't necessarily agree with that argument, but just to give some credit to that, something that really fucking cracked me up was on page 22 when he's looking at Goebbels' diary. August 19th, privately the Fuhrer is very irritated with himself, having been deceived so much about the potential of the Bolsheviks by reports from German agents in the Soviet Union. And then on September 16th, we calculated the potential of the Bolsheviks in a completely erroneous way.
Yeah.
Just looking at the camera, I've made a terrible mistake.
Yeah. But it's quite clear that Stalin was intensely concerned with the problem of defense, and that, I think, has a lot to do with the non-aggression pact that he made. We'll get into that a little further in, I think.
Yeah. But even, just to go back to Trotsky's initial criticism of him being totally unprepared, I mean, to think of not only the pre-invasion actions, the development of all the industries east of the Urals, right? I'm looking at 25. 2 days after the German invasion, the Committee for Evacuation succeeded in moving 1,500 large industrial companies to the east at the end of titanic operations of great logistical complexity. To follow that up, this is to quote Hitler himself. Overall, we must recognize that workshops of the scale of the Hermann Göring work have been built where 2 years ago there were only unknown villages. We are discovering railway lines that are not on the maps.
Yeah.
Damn, son.
Yeah, and even previous to that, with regard to the Blitzkrieg, Losurdo quotes Churchill and FDR calling Stalin's response a, quote, splendid defense coming from the Soviet army. And he notes that it does not appear merely formal. So, I mean, not that we should be looking for our fucking kudos from FDR and Churchill, but...
I mean, yeah. Especially comparing that to at the time, like, there's a point at which British intelligence says that they won't even last 8 weeks.
Yeah.
The U.S. was like, they'll be dead by June.
Yeah.
And look what happened, huh? We raced to Berlin. Not we. Well, we did race to Berlin, but we didn't win it. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah. That's really all I got for Chapter 1.
Okay, so Chapter 2, right? The Bolsheviks, from ideological conflict to civil war. And just to start us off, I really appreciate the quote on 39. Losurdo brings it up. A dialectic on the basis of which Saturn devours his children is certainly not an exclusive characteristic of the October Revolution. The choral unity that presides over the overthrow of an ancient regime now disliked by the majority of the population inevitably cracks or disappears when it comes to deciding on the new order to be built.
Yeah.
And he does a lot to talk about betrayal in a broad sense here. What does betrayal in the eyes of Kautsky, in the eyes of Trotsky, didn't mean for that to rhyme, what does that actually stem from? Because something that sort of points out, which I think is really interesting, is that their points are the same. Kautsky and Trotsky. That's going to piss me off. Karl Kautsky and Leon Trotsky. No, that's not any better. He says that their points are ultimately the same. At some point, their methods became impure, in whatever quote that means. And it's a discussion that still has to be had because we're still fucking talking about purity politics today. We're still fucking talking about purity politics. I just had the interesting thought that it's interesting to think that we're talking about the opposite side of the spectrum in a lot of our online discourse now, where in relation to Stalin here, we're saying that his impure quote-unquote tactics were necessary, But now we're saying that, like, is it really purity testing to hold a line for these people? The difference is obviously in the situation at hand. We're not nearly close enough to a revolutionary moment for these differences to actually be meaningful. In Stalin's case, though, it definitely is. They were certainly in the revolutionary moment to the point where these differences were an issue.
Yeah, there's a quote on the bottom of 40 that jumps out to me. This is in the context of Losurdo talking about Trotsky's motif of the revolution betrayed. The accusation or suspicion of betrayal emerged at every turning point of this particularly torturous revolution, pushed by the needs of government actions to rethink certain original utopian motives and still forced to limit its great ambitions with the extreme difficulty of the objective situation. Yep. And regarding talking about purity politics or purity testing, this idea of holding the ideal but addressing the reality, I think, is broader than even just the context of the conversation just around holding the line with communists. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is, I think, largely indicative of the divide between anarchists and communists, for example, which we talked about in the last episode. Right. I think communists are much more generally reactive to the material reality, and anarchists are less forgiving of letting go of the ideal.
Yeah.
And I think that there is certainly a tension there that needs to be wrestled with. But the context is wildly different to talk about that versus
certainly
Trotsky and Stalin and
Yeah.
being in the middle of the revolutionary moment and then having these schisms where Bukharin is talking about killing Lenin, Trotsky is talking about assassinating Stalin. I mean, like, it's just fucking wild.
Right. Yeah, I know that. And I mean, even on 41, he talks about the kinds of uprisings that were put down. I mean, anarchists love to talk about Kronstadt all the time because they view it as, you know, the true movement of the people put down by the horrid elitist bureaucracy. And it just happened all the time. I mean, even Georgia, right? The country of Georgia, the Soviets had to invade, and it was Menshevik controlled for a while. The Caucasus are fucking crazy overall, if you want to talk about the national question or whatever. But, like, during the Civil War, they had to put down so many of these fucking things that I don't know.
Frankly, a lot of this chapter was kind of inscrutable to me.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of specific references that I didn't really understand. So my takeaways are going to be either hyper-specific on a particular thing or so broad that I don't know how useful they're going to be. But stuff that really stood out to me. Number one, I guess since I'm on the page, there's a really interesting editor's note here on 41 that talks about anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Incipient anti-Semitism permeated the culture of the Russian Empire, including many leftist formations which carried over into the revolutionary state. This phenomenon tragically brought to life Marx's remarks from Critique of the Gotha program that any new society is stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it comes. And this is one of those things that, again, in my prerequisite knowledge of Stalin, I had an attitude of a lot of Stalin's actions as being anti-Semitic.
Right.
And I'm not going to say that that's untrue, but it is, I think, what this chapter has helped me recognize, especially because Trotsky's throwing around anti-Semitic
really
remarks left
shit.
and right.
Well, he was Jewish.
I know.
Yeah. That's it's so funny because Trotsky's he's like caricatured in propaganda as this like huge Judeo-Bolshevik menace, you know, stomping all over Europe.
But I mean, like, that's always something that's made me uncomfortable about talking about Stalin is like the inherent anti-Semitism. But again, contextualizing it here, and I think the quote from the Gotha program is really, really important one.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And if you learn anything about the relationship of Jews in the Soviet Union, you'll find out very quickly that it is a very strange one. Especially the historical relationship between Israel and the Soviet Union up until about 1967. It's kind of wild. But it's also hand in hand with the treatment of Jews throughout all of Europe. That's a total aside.
Fair enough.
I don't know how specific we really need to get here. He's just talking about that chasm. The chasm between the ideal and the practical. Between the concrete utopia and the abstract utopia.
Yeah.
I think that's really what most of this chapter is about. And he's just bringing up again and again all these different examples, you know, like how the Ministry of Foreign Affairs says it will no longer be necessary, but in fact, obviously, it is very necessary in the situation, you know, or even the idea of a separate peace. Just as we were talking about in Spain, do you prosecute the revolution or do you win the war? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a decision that had to be made right there. I have heard from one source, at least, that Trotsky was of the opinion that that the Soviets should let the Germans steamroll them, and then the peasantry would simply rise up against them. Come on now.
Not a great take.
Yeah, so it's that question again, right? Do we prosecute the revolution? Do we complete the war? And in the Soviets' case, they chose a separate peace because guess what, man? They were getting fucking murdered.
Yeah, and even beyond that and underlying a lot of the kind of conflict within the Bolshevik Party is the question of internationalism also.
Yeah.
That comes up a lot in this chapter, and so it's not even just talking about civil unrest in the USSR, but then what is the purpose of a socialist revolution in the USSR? Figureheads like Trotsky argue that needs to take on an international character or else it's not a socialist revolution. And Stalin is butting up against the realities of that. I have a lot of random quotes here about internationalism in this context. Let's go to 44, because from the point of view of Trotsky and of his allies, there could be no more doubts. The choice of socialism in one country with the consequent abandonment of the idea of world revolution was not dictated by political realism in the calculation of the relations of force, but only by bureaucratic routine, opportunism, cowardice, and ultimately betrayal. And I think that that's just a bad interpretation of the reality that they were facing. But another thing that I thought was funny, and this was a line that I'd not read before coming directly from Stalin. Stalin says the idea of exporting a revolution is nonsense. Every country, if it wants one, will produce its own revolution. And if it doesn't, there will be no revolution. Thus, for instance, our country wanted to make a revolution and made it. And this is an outrage to Trotsky. I don't think that that's exclusionary to the idea of supporting revolutions elsewhere,
Right.
which is Trotsky's criticism of it that follows. But I think it's a reasonable position.
I mean, yeah, I think it's in line with the idea of like where the people are literally at.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. Trotsky is very funny when he says that clearly it's a natural transition to that of revolution in a single country too. But yeah, I totally agree. I mean, and you see that. I'm thinking about Che Guevara, honestly, trying to export the Cuban Revolution to the rest of South America led to his death.
Yep.
And that's not to say that Bolivia was ready or not ready for revolution or whatever, but, there's consequences to those actions. I mean, the entire history of the Soviet foreign policy and also the Chinese foreign policy, which were not always aligned, shows that kind of, it's almost like realpolitik. It's a reaction to what's going on in the world. It's this balancing of the ideal versus the actual concrete reality, choosing your allies on a global stage. And it's not that I always agree with those things. I mean, I just got done listening to Blowback about Angola, and the Chinese supported the FMLA, which were fucking led by a guy who was backed by the CIA, and it was solely on the basis that that party felt it was apt to make revolution now. And the MPLA, which was backed by the Soviets, was not necessarily on the same page. But there's a more of a concrete reality to these things,
Yep.
And I hate to be that guy. I really do. But it's like, just fucking read a book about it, man, and you'll see exactly the issues. The entire Sino-Soviet split. Like, forget comparing and contrasting, like, the Soviets to the rest of the West, right? Just look at the difference between the Soviets' actions on a foreign level and the Chinese actions on a foreign level. China was more than willing to, quote-unquote, export revolution in a lot of places, and a lot of times it didn't necessarily go so well, right? I mean, they supported Pol Pot.
Whoops.
Whoops. Whoops.
Whoopsie.
Oh, I let a Pol Pot slip into my bag of goods by accident. Yeah.
There's a section of this chapter that is sort of written as a polemic against Kollontai, and I have one of her collections. I haven't read it yet. I'm interested to read more of that. I'm interested to get more into specific Marxist feminist theory, which is on the docket for us.
Yeah.
There is an interesting attitude toward the family and parental responsibility that Losurdo seems very clearly critical of that comes from Kollontai's theory. But
Yeah, and I think the thing that resonated to me the most about it is when he's talking about Hegel, and he's talking about the particular and the universal. And I think there is something to that. If we're talking about a collective that's made up of individuals, there is a blurring of the line between the collective and the individual. The question of how much is a real question. In Kollontai's case, she's saying that it's blurred completely, right? I don't think of your child, my child. I think of our children.
the children.
The contemporary communist response is to say that, you're literally ignoring the particular. You're ignoring the personal responsibility you might have to your children before you let them go out to the rest of the world. And it's interesting to think about that in the context of, like, the current social contract, how we expect parents to prepare their kids for to then go out and take part of society. So much of a more recent breakdown in that thought process has come from the fact that people are just more hands-off with their kids like that.
Perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have much to say about that other than I kind of dog-eared it as something that might be worth coming back to after we read some Kollontai and other Marxist feminists.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that I need a more feminist perspective here before I make a final decision. What the fuck? Before I choose me, the feminism understander. No, but it is interesting. And unfortunately, it's got to fucking do with Hegel again, man.
Yeah.
It's got to do with Hegel again. Oh, God.
A quick note, something that I didn't know about that made me feel like an idiot, because probably you're going to be like, yeah, you didn't know about that? The Stakhanovites?
Yeah.
That's a really interesting concept to me, and it is something that I don't know how it actually plays out in the historical record, so to speak, but I would believe that that would be a kind of natural consequence of a socialist revolution, where people would see their role as now having value, so much so that they take great pride in it and work very hard. And I think even in a situation like in the United States, there are still folks that so pride themselves on how hard they work and how much they do to provide for their families, that it just, I don't know, I'd never heard of that, but it's a really interesting concept and something that I would expect as a natural consequence. And it's fun to know that there was a group that so strongly felt
that. We have talked about it just a little bit before, and at the time I didn't know anything about it. Now I do know a little bit about it, and it's this. One guy, Stakhanov, he was a miner, and I think he produced 19 times the quota or something like that in one shift.
Yeah.
And there is a question. Actually, the follow-up to the Soviet Society Between Revolutions book that I read is all about the Stakhanovite movement. I'm very interested in it. But there is a question, right, how much of that is coming from the people's zealous faith, as Losurdo says, and how much of that was not co-opted, but utilized from the top down. And I just think it's an interesting relationship. But the thing that is most interesting about it is exactly what you said, right? It shows that there is, in fact, socialist competition. There is that kind of, I think they call it socialist emulation in here, where it's that competitive drive, you know? And I think that it's exactly like you said, right? People are understanding their actual value.
Yeah, I mean, how many people right now, today, how many people listening to this feel like their job is fucking worthless and they don't give a shit about it?
Yeah.
They are in it because they need whatever it is that it's providing for them.
Right.
Probably, if you're in the United States, healthcare and, of course, a paycheck. Those are the reasons people stay in shitty jobs that they don't like or don't feel value them.
Yeah.
What if you were in a position where your job actually mattered and you saw people recognizing that?
Yeah, and there's something so interesting about that, too, because you see that in some of the labor problems of the Soviet Union. Like, for example, the turnover rate was really high, and some people might say, oh, it's because of mismanagement or bureaucracy or totalitarianism or whatever. But ask yourself this, right? If you could do anything right now, what would you do? Many people probably don't have an answer. Many people probably would have to try a bunch of things and figure out what would be a best fit for them. If you're in a position where your job or the ability for upward mobility to another job that might be better suited for you is possible, then yeah, you would leave your job. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's just kind of that recontextualization of the kind of age-old problems we hear about the Soviet Union in a new light.
Yeah, I mean, remove the coercive elements of employment. When your material needs are taken care of outside of your employment,
yeah.
Of course, if you're not vibing with your job, you try something else.
Yeah.
Because you're not forced to stay in a job that you hate and you find soul crushing or whatever.
Right. And not to mention too that he talks a lot about how Soviet workers were able to advocate for better conditions, and a lot of time the things they were advocating for weren't wages but respect, working conditions, right? Mm-hmm. The way that their foreman would address them, things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, a crazy note that was in kind of towards the end of the section we read was that absenteeism wasn't a fireable offense in China until 1993.
I was going to say, 92, 93.
Which is crazy.
Yeah.
If I don't show up for my job 2 times in a week, I get nervous, which is rare. If I'm I got to call it a second day, I better start fucking updating my resume or whatever. No, not really. But people live in that position.
For sure.
Not a fireable offense, man. We live in a fucking right-to-work state. God damn.
I still have a couple other random things.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the state a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of the extinction of the state comes up a little bit in this chapter, and so I've got a couple of quotes to throw out around that. I'll start on 58.
Okay.
Because this is kind of the question. When and in what manner does the process of extinction of the state, envisioned by Marx, begin after the overcoming of capitalism? It's not going to be immediate. I'm sorry. That's not going to happen. But when can we imagine it? And we've mentioned previously when talking about China, I think it was around the question, is China a socialist? Yeah. And it's really Well, they say by 2050 they're going to be.
Right.
So, like, okay, it's going to take time, obviously. They're doing what they're doing. I mean, we know about the NEP and the USSR. So, like, obviously, there are going to be things that happen that change. We're facing that concrete reality and not looking at that kind of utopian ideal any longer.
I'm just thinking of that conversation on China, because I remember saying that I was starting to feel that the expansion of the state was not antithetical to its withering away. And I think that Losurdo is saying something similar here on 59, if I may.
Yeah, please.
He says, but doesn't massively extending the state apparatus and forcefully posing the problem of its improvement mean effectively renouncing the ideal of the extinction of the state? Of course, the realization of this ideal can be postponed to a very remote future, just as you were saying, right? But in the meantime, how should public property, which has now undergone an enormous expansion, be managed? Right? And what form should power take in the Soviet Russia as a whole? You know, even thinking of our anarchist conversation, right? Your beautiful Vanguard has a beautiful anarchist revolution. How do you distribute things to people? How do you organize that in a way, right? At what point is that organization a state? We are ultimately talking about the expansion of the state, the very expansion, might I add, which allowed the Bolsheviks to win the Civil War. It's that statecraft that allowed their victory. In other historical examples, the inability to build that same kind of state structure has led to the downfall of a lot of these movements.
Yep. This is sort of a tangent, but related to the concept of the state. There's this quote on 61 that really jumped out to me. This is Stalin talking about the Constitution in the USSR, the 1936 Constitution.
Another thing we talked about on the last episode, too.
Yeah. He says, the idea of the Constitution is a bourgeois idea. In Stalin words, the 1936 Constitution does not confine itself to stating the formal rights of citizens, but stresses the guarantee of these rights, the means by which these rights can be exercised. And I think that's a good summation of the position I've tried to articulate here, is that writing it down on paper doesn't guarantee it to be true, but having it written on paper is something that can be protected, and that ability to protect it is the thing that makes it true.
I mean, you know, laws are threats, right? Laws are threats. A law indicates its enforcement. That's why we write it into law, so it can be enforced. That's exactly what Stalin is saying here in terms of the Constitution. It's like the means for you to express these rights, that's what we're trying to enforce here. Not necessarily that the rights are written out expressly. And I think that it goes back to that same kind of ideal of justice, ideal of the ideals that we were talking about when it comes to Marx, alongside like the German ideology, where it's like, what ultimately is creating these rights and justices is like the material conditions around them, you know, and the differences in the conditions will also change those rights as well.
Yeah.
And that's what Stalin's saying here, right? We mean to guarantee the conditions for those rights to exist, not necessarily that we're writing those rights exist on paper.
Yep, well said. I mean, another point that's posed in regards to the extinction of the state comes around encirclement on 62 that really stood out to me. To those who demanded that the problem of the extinction of the state be confronted, Stalin responded in 1938 by urging not to turn the lesson of Marx and Engels into dogma and empty scholasticism. The delay in the realization of the ideal was explained by permanent capitalist encirclement. Like, the position that I'm taking on this now and my own attitude toward it is, it's impossible to do away with the state when you are still surrounded by imperialist powers that seek to eliminate you.
You know, it's just like I said on the last episode, if your borders are defined by the 4 countries that surround you, then those are your borders.
Exactly.
You know, yeah.
Exactly. There is an interesting bit here about the third function of the state here that I just want to throw out real quick because I'm on this page. Stalin's, I would call it a based attitude toward the third function of the state. Obviously, traditional functions of the state, defense against the class enemy at domestic and international levels. Okay, so we've got 2 functions of the state there. Stalin drew an attention to a third function. This was the work of economic organization and cultural education, performed by our state bodies with the purpose of developing the infant shoots of the new socialist economic system and re-educating the people in the spirit of socialism. Now, with the main task of our state inside the country is the work of peaceful economic organization and cultural education.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think that it's hand in hand with everything we've been reading from Stalin, talking about empowering the people to run the state, to run these institutions. And I think that it also a big thought I was having throughout this section is the idea of, both in Lenin and Mao, right, the shifting of the contradiction from one that is antagonistic to one that is not antagonistic. If the state in its current form represents an antagonistic contradiction, it's not that the contradiction is dissolved just by its inversion, which that's what we're ideally talking about in the Soviet Union. But it's a shift in that contradiction from one that is antagonistic to one that is non-antagonistic. When Stalin's talking about the third function, protecting property from thieves and pilferers and things like that, I'm thinking about the difference between the two scenarios, right? We do the same kind of thing in today's society. We protect property from pilferers and thieves, quote unquote, but that is an antagonistic contradiction because it is protecting, like, literally an exploiting class, a minority class. In the sense of a mass of people protecting their gains, I think that's more non-antagonistic than the former.
I would agree.
I don't think that this necessarily is the best example, but I think a lot of times throughout this you'll see where there is still a contradiction in Soviet society, but in a lot of ways you can see what Lenin and Stalin and Mao are hinting at. We're saying that we're now in a situation where this contradiction is not antagonistic. There's a possibility of resolution without that kind of upheaval in the same sense.
Yeah, there's a quote later where Stalin talks about merging the state and the people.
Yeah.
So it becomes so non-antagonistic that they become one and the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Every time we read Stalin, we see it. They're constantly talking about empowering the people. And even, I don't know if it's in this point, but even before the height of the terror in 37 and 38, you see Stalin say that terror is no longer needed. Terror is no longer necessary. It's ineffective, right? He's calling for the Soviets to bring the workers and the masses forward into the structures of government. And you can start to see that shift, right? The things that happen that then make that pendulum swing back, as Anne Applebaum unfortunately says here in later on, is like actual real-world events, right? It's like the assassination of Kirov, right? That's the start of the terror that's mentioned in the very next section.
Yeah.
Or it's the third civil war, as he says, between the split in the party, right? Or ultimately, it's the fucking Nazis. That's honestly the thing that is the most soul-crushing about this history, is that there is a trend, a positive trend in development, even through the terror. The question of where it would have gone will never be answered.
Yeah.
Because they were fucking invaded.
Yep.
Like, who knows? Who knows? I sure don't.
Yeah.
I don't know if I really have that much to say about the Kirov assassination. The main reason that Losurdo is bringing it up here is because it is like a point of history that is often pointed out as a Stalinist conspiracy. And it's just not true.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where they were like, Stalin had this guy assassinated so he would have the justification to do all these purges. And that's simply not the case. I don't have all the details at hand to go into it, but it's just not true. Like, it's just a lie.
Yeah.
Straight up.
Largely propagated by people that were planning assassinations against Stalin.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty crazy. I mean, to talk about the purges and all of that stuff is to set up, like, why they try to do the purges and then, like, what the actual rebuttal to that argument is. I don't know if I'm even equipped to do that right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
But
I feel the same way, I mean.
The answer is just that there is more context necessary. You can go and read actual history about what was happening then and see that it's not as clear-cut as Anne Applebaum would fucking say.
Yeah.
That's just the case. And I think the Kirov assassination is a great point because, just to put something out there, right? Kirov was pretty fucking friendly with Stalin. They were like, it's not that they were buddies, but they were like, he was very loyal to Stalin. Mm-hmm. And there is even some pushback. I mean, reading the Thurston book about the Stalin terror was really eye-opening in the ways that the people closest to Stalin were often talking about reform straight to Stalin. They were straight up saying, this is fucked up. Even Yagoda, Losurdo actually quotes him here, where he, at the height of like 36, 37, 38, the chief prosecutor of the Soviet Union speaks about how horrid the conditions are in the Gulag. The head of the NKVD says, like, this is rotten to the core and must be upended. It's like, it's not that these people weren't aware and trying to change these things. It's just the fact that, like, they had Trotsky over there in exile saying, hey, buddy, the Civil War is coming. I don't give a fuck that you're being invaded by Hitler right now. It just means that I can seize the Golden Fleece even better. There's real stuff happening here.
Yeah.
I don't find the need to go case by case and say, actually, he didn't want Kirov assassinated, and actually the Ryutin affair was a real thing, and actually, Tukhachevsky may have been a red Bonapartist threat that was being sponsored by the fascists, There is some interesting note. There is something interesting, though, about Trotsky and fascism, I will say, because a lot of times people will say that to be a Trotskyist is like essentially to be a fascist, and I finally have made the connection why here, and it's
There's
because
that Goebbels quote.
Yeah, he was straight up. He was a fucking mark is the answer. He was a goddamn rube. He was used to create dissension in the Soviet Union at time of their invasion. So in that sense, yeah, to support Trotsky at that time would be to support fascism.
Yeah, I actually am open on that page, on 82.
Yeah.
It is all the more difficult to decipher the interweaving of political conflicts within Soviet Russia and international tensions because the suspicions and accusations are further fueled by the substantial reality of a fifth column and the disinformation operations carried out by Hitler's German Secret Service. In April 1938, Goebbels noted in his diary, "Our clandestine radio transmitter from East Prussia to Russia is causing a great stir. It operates in the name of Trotsky and gives Stalin a hard time." If you've got fucking Goebbels' stamp of approval, you're on the wrong side of history.
Well, even on the next page, right, Goebbels says, "We are now working with 3 underground radio stations. The first is Trotskyist."
Yep.
I mean, God, even in, like, the Cold War history, the idea of, like, the color revolution and all of this stuff, it's like, even if those people were, like, straight up dead-ass Trotskyists, you know, they were, like, the true inheritors of the mantle of Lenin, it's like, they were being supported by the fucking Nazis for the purpose of breaking up actually existing socialism.
Yeah.
That really pisses me off.
Same.
I want to give Trots the benefit of the doubt. I really, really do. I really, really do. But if you're at the end of the day, if you're doing Goebbels' bidding, buddy, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
You know?
So chapter 3, the origins of Stalinism. There is some really interesting stuff. Oh, there's a typo on this page on 91. Let's jump forward about half a century. A prophecy even more fitting, indeed positively amazing for its prescience. I got an eagle eye.
Give my refund. Run me my money back, Iskra books.
But there is a lot in this chapter about the national question.
Yeah.
If we want to jump around to that a little bit. I would start on 99.
Okay.
So this was the basis for supporting Soviet Russia for Alexei Brusilov, the brilliant general of noble birth who tried in vain to save his officers who were driven to suicide by the savage violence of the peasant rebels. My sense of duty to the nation has often obliged me to disobey my natural social inclinations. A few years later, in 1927, in drawing a portrait of Moscow, Walter Benjamin sharply highlighted the strong national sense that Bolshevism has developed in all Russians without distinction.
Yeah.
That's that kind of duty of nation or duty to nation that obviously can be detrimental, can be dangerous, but is certainly a very uniting, powerful thing when you are faced with a common enemy that I'm starting to feel is an integral part to a socialist revolution finding fruition.
Yeah. It's interesting because Stalin was from Georgia. This is for later when I inevitably read a biography of Stalin, but there's something so interesting about that he was put at the head of Russia in that sense. Vladislav Zubak, who wrote Collapse about the Soviet Union, has another book called A Failed Empire where he talks about the foreign policies, and he poses Stalin as someone who's seeking to reclaim the mantle of a great Russia. And I don't necessarily agree because I think that there is a creation of a new identity in the Soviet Union that happens here. But something very interesting on 100 that I appreciated is actually at the bottom where he says, unlike Trotsky, who came to Bolshevism late in life, Stalin represented the historical continuity of the party as protagonist of the revolution and hence holder of a new legality. Moreover, by affirming the realizability of socialism even in a single large country, Stalin conferred a new dignity and identity on the Russian nation, which could thus overcome the frightful crisis, ideal as well as material, it had suffered since the defeat and chaos of the First World War, thereby recovering its historical continuity.
Yeah.
It's just to double back on that, the power of the nation. The historical role of nationalism is evident in something like this. You know, it's evident in the creation of the Soviet Union, even if that is a new identity, even if that is a new form of nation even.
Yeah, I think, I'm getting wrapped up in our discussion around what the national character of the United States might be in a context like this. And it's, like we were saying, it's kind of to live up to the ideal of what it's supposed to be, which is a nation that finds its strength in its unification of diversity. And I think Stalin is an embodiment of that in that way also, being born in Georgia and becoming the embodiment of the national character of the USSR as its figurehead. There's something really powerful in that.
Not to do some kind of like root analysis of Stalin, but like there's something very interesting about his interest in linguistics when you compare the difference between Russian and Georgian. It is not easy to learn Russian from Georgian. I'm not trying to pinpoint the point in Stalin's life, but like, you know, you can see that kind of natural interest in the language development when you have to go from such a stark language from one to the other. You know, if you have to learn a language like that, I think that it does something. It'll change your mind in some ways, and I think that coming back to what Stalin's saying about linguistics being outside of the superstructure, right? Not having a class character. I think that there's something in that in his early life, transitioning from literally from Georgian to Russian. Something there.
Yeah, well said. I'm on 107 here. I'm trying to figure out if it's worth trying to put this thought together, because there's an interesting characterization on the national question between Trotsky and what ultimately is Stalin. Mm-hmm. Trotsky's position, it states on 107, for Trotsky to approach the prospects of a social revolution within national boundaries means yielding to or indulging in social patriotism and the social chauvinism co-responsible for the carnage of the First World War, which is not, to Trotsky's credit, entirely an unreasonable take. But that means that for Trotsky, the idea of a socialist development which is occurring and is even being completed in one country is an essentially national reformist and not revolutionary internationalist point of view. That's where I disagree with him there.
Right.
But then the next paragraph down, we get this other bit where it's contrasting Trotsky's criticism that he made with Kollontai. Mm-hmm. Just as it does not constitute a real overcoming of domestic egoism to ignore and evade the particular responsibilities one has towards one's children and closest kin, so it is by no means synonymous with internationalism to lose sight of the fact that the concrete possibilities of the task of revolutionary transformation are to be found in the first place on a definite national terrain.
Yeah, that's that quote I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
It gets back into that thing, right? The particular inside of the universal.
Exactly, yes.
Fucking Hegel.
Fucking Hegel.
Fucking Hegel.
God damn it.
It's not a question that I think we can answer right now, but I think it is a truly interesting question.
Yeah.
There is somewhere on the spectrum where you land.
There just continue to be new layers to this question that I was initially very dismissive of, just because I had a kind of gut reaction against, what you might call national chauvinism or something, It's way more complicated than that.
It just is. I think I agree with Stalin. I think that language is something that, while there are class aspects to language, I don't think that it is entirely something that is class-driven. And I think similarly about the nation also. I'm kind of coming around to that.
In the context of a unified national character does not have to be inherently ethnically exclusionary or something like that, which is how national movements are often characterized. Hitler's national movement obviously very clearly definitely is. It doesn't have to be exclusive. And in fact, in order to be especially productive with a socialist character, a national identity must be largely around, what Stalin was writing about in his scholarship around the national question. Yeah. It has to be one that is welcoming of all people, open to all people.
I think it just has to do with abstract universalism here. And I'm thinking about in the next section where he's talking about the inability of abstract universalism to appreciate the particular is a cause of violence. It's it's just that there's a missing piece. It's not that the universal is not worthwhile. It's just that it's not the whole picture. You're missing half of the dialectic. And it's the individual portion of it, right? To just hold a completely abstract universalism, there's something missing in that, And I think it's something very interesting that Losurdo expands that to is the idea of collective leadership, which is something we've talked about before, like ultramassive democracy or whatever. But there is within that an abstract universalism, and reading this just gives me some pause towards that because I can see the ways in which it ignores the particular in that sense, and I do in some sense agree with Losurdo in the fact that it might cause violence. Just think about the affirmative actionness of the USSR, right? They had 160 ethnicities in there. They all received funding in their own language. They received movies and operas and all sorts of cultural shit. They had a flag, an anthem. I mean, that's not for nothing, right? It's crazy to me all the time that people think of the USSR as just Russia. I mean, I know that the Russian Socialist Federation was a huge part of it, but and also a central part of it, but there's something really there for me about the connection between the universal and the particular, and it's possible to go too far in the other way. Like a huge critique of Gorbachev is that kind of recognition of these ethnic minorities, some people will argue, is partially what led to this kind of newly refound nationalism in the 80s and 90s that then led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so there's just that balance in there. Like, how can you hold the universal without also erasing the particular?
Yeah, there are a lot of quotes in this section around that kind of dialectic that I was trying to find the right one.
Yeah, and not to shit on our anarchist listeners, but I really thought it was hilarious when he's calling that ideal, that universal, anarchoid messianism.
Anarchoid messianism.
Anarchoid messianism. Yeah. I don't know. It's crazy how topical this was to the last episode as well.
It's funny the way that keeps
Yeah.
working out.
Yeah.
Just to throw out the quote, because I love reading quotes. The line where he first names the anarchoid messianism on 111. An anarchoid messianism emerges which demands absolute freedom and is ready to denounce as a betrayal any contamination of and restriction to universality, real or presumed.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting, even thinking back to when we read Conquest of Bread, Kropotkin rails against even the division of labor as a concept, and I see an echo of that on 112. Losurdo says, in the situation of exalted universalism which presides over the overthrow of an ancien regime, every division of labor, however articulated, becomes synonymous with exclusivism, of seizure of universal self-consciousness and universal will by a bureaucratic and privileged minority.
Yeah.
Any semblance of separation is suddenly seen as a betrayal, even, a betrayal to that ideal. That's something that is really supportive of that kind of messianism of anarchists, of that anarchist ideal, which I still hold space for. Like we've said plenty.
Well, yeah, and two thoughts on that. First, right after the quote that you read, Losurdo asserts very clearly, no existing order can fulfill the anarchoid messianist's desire for the immediate and unmediated realization of universality. That's calling to me in this moment that line from Marx about the Gotha program, from the Gotha program that we read earlier just a moment ago, that you're always bearing the marks of what came before. So it's never going to meet that kind of litmus test because it's always going to be, to a degree, held down by the society it was born from previously.
Yeah.
Secondarily, he talks a lot, and we kind of skipped over it, but he talks a lot in these first chapters about the kind of messianism, however you would say that, messianism of revolution in general, and how that's ultimately part of where these schisms come from inside the Bolshevik Party.
And also the French Revolution, he says very specifically, it's not exclusive to the October Revolution alone. In every sense where there's this huge social upheaval, there is a cleavage, essentially, where people have to reckon with the possibility of reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not exclusive to the anarchoid messianism or whatever.
Yeah. And just to read this here, I'm at the bottom of 112, and I'm also going to read on 113. But he says, this is from Hegel.
Yep.
To pass into a deed, to achieve reality and efficacy and become actual concrete will, Hegel continues, universality must find expression in concrete individuals, right? Who ultimately is executing this universal program? It is ultimately a group of individuals, right? The individual can't be lost in that process. And he says, it must, quote, put an individual consciousness at the forefront. Here's where messianism and anarchism cry scandal. Okay, to go a little further down. The tragedy of the French Revolution, but also and on a larger scale the October Revolution, consists in this. If it wants to avoid being reduced to an empty phrase, the pathos of universality must give itself a concrete and determined content. But it is precisely this concrete and determined content that is perceived as betrayal.
Yep.
And then finally, quote, universal freedom can thus produce neither a positive achievement nor a deed. There is left for it only negative action. It is merely the rage and fury of destruction.
Yeah. That bit about the dialectic of content, that it needs to be concrete, but once it is concretized, it is no longer universal, is just so fucking good.
Yeah. Well, and this is, again, why I was like fucking Hegel all the time, because he says that, I'm looking at 50, right? Hegel says that there is an issue, right, in the idea of material equality, which is at the basis of the claim of the community of goods. If one proceeds to the equal satisfaction of the different needs of individuals, it is clear that there is an inequality in the relation of the share of participation, i.e., the distribution of goods. If, on the other hand, one proceeds to an equal distribution, then it is clear the satisfaction of needs is unequal. If the goal is for everyone to have their needs met, how do you deal with that? Right? And what Marx is saying is that there's two stages, right? He says, in the socialist stage, distribution according to an equal right, i.e. paying with an equal yardstick by each individual and different from time to time, produces an obvious inequality in pay and income, in the sense that the equal right is nothing but the right of inequality. In the communist stage, the equal satisfaction of the various needs also entails an inequality in the distribution, only that the enormous development of the productive forces by fully satisfying the needs of all renders this inequality irrelevant. So, Chapter 4, the complex and contradictory course of the Stalin era. That's an interesting question. I don't know how interesting it really is, but does Stalinism really exist?
No.
People. I mean, yes. Maybe we won't agree on this. Yeah, yes and no, right? Yes and no. Like, yes, there are clearly policies put in the place in the era of Stalin that are reflective of Stalin and the people around him's attitude to the current situation. Whether that is Stalinism in a codified ideological idea, obviously not.
Yeah, for me, that question just boils down to what did Stalin add to the theory
Yeah.
that requires the S be added to the M of that ML or MLM,
I'm MLLSMTP. I can't think of any other people. It doesn't matter.
I mean, all of Stalin's scholarship was around the national question, essentially. You know what I mean? I don't think that he added anything to the theory. I think his scholarship and his policy was focused on the implementation of Marxism-Leninism.
Yeah.
So I think Stalinism is largely a boogeyman word that people use to try to talk about totalitarianism, another made-up thing.
Yeah. I mean, he says it right here on 122. He says, Stalinism, in quotes, is not primarily the result either of an individual's thirst for power or of an ideology, but rather of the permanent state of exception. So once again, just look at the scenario, bro. He had to do all of that terror and all of those purges, bro. Trust me, bro. But I will say that just to add some credence to this, I really appreciated on 122 and 123 that he says, at what point was Stalin really an autocrat? Up until 1937, at least, he was not exempt from having to contend with criticism, dissent, and outright opposition within the Communist Party. The Leninist tradition of the party dictatorship and of oligarchic power persisted. Yeah, up until, in any case, from 1937 and the outbreak of the Great Terror, the party dictatorship did give way to autocracy. Mm-hmm. So I guess there is a question, right? To what extent is that acceptable? To what extent are the threats to actually existing socialism so severe that the oligarchic or whatever party, the Leninist party structure is removed? Just to put it back into the context, right? It's not that this is a Russia exclusive thing. I mean, in the same way, you could consider FDR's third and fourth term to be the result of the same kind of state of exception. Mm-hmm. Much with the same kind of popular support from below, I might add, based on the same kind of increases in their standards of living, right? The same kind of increases in their upward mobility. There's that same kind of popular base that we're seeing, that Losurdo says that Stalin had, based on the same things. But in U.S. history, we say, hey, that was the bee's knees, huh? We had FDR, bring that guy back. We need a New Deal. It's like, we can't do the same thing for Stalin?
Yeah, and I mean, we're about to get into the gulags here, too.
Yeah.
So I think this is just another example of the same sort of thing where it's like not necessarily a defense that makes it permissible,
right?
But it does contextualize it in a way that makes it not so exclusive to Stalin.
Yeah. And here at the bottom of 123, you can see what I was referring to earlier. He's talking about the Civil War, the NEP, and what is happening looking forward. Even Bukharin says that a sort of rule of law is necessary, right? The peasant must have before him Soviet order, Soviet right, Soviet law, and not Soviet arbitrariness, moderated by a bureau of complaints whose whereabouts is unknown. Peaceful organizational work is what we're talking about. And he says that we must stand for persuasion and only for persuasion. Terror no longer makes sense. Its time has passed.
Yep.
But again, what could have happened without the Nazis? You see a shift. You see a shift in the emphasis, right? On 124, he says that now we're tasked to master science, right? To expand those developmental forces. And there's something in that I think has to do with our modern situation as well. And it's the question of, like, part of that terror in Russia has to do with this massive industrialization, forced collectivization, and whatnot. Why would we expect to see the same thing in the modern era? If we're talking about the development of the productive forces to the point where socialism or communism can be achieved, how far away really are we from that point? In a scenario like in Russia, where Stalin is looking at the technological prowess of all of the people that he's encircled by and saying, we need to catch up with this or else, there is a justification for that kind of acceleration. Whereas in the modern context, I just don't know if you see the same kind of thing. I'm talking about in the global north. I mean, obviously, I think in a lot of global south countries, you would still see this kind of development maybe, but I just don't think we would see that same kind of shift in emphasis. The idea of undergoing the same kind of forced collectivization process that we're talking about that Russia underwent, I don't think is necessarily true if we're talking about many other contexts.
Yeah, I think I'm following. So you're saying like it's not reasonable as a criticism of potential socialist revolution today to look at forced collectivization, for example, as like a reason not to do it because the context is so different that it would no longer be necessary?
Yes, in a sense. I mean, I don't have like an empirical study of what that might be, but I don't know. It just seems to me that we produce so much frivolous trash that it wouldn't really take the same kind of increase in productive forces to reach a similar stage. You know what I mean? Like, we wouldn't have to undergo the same kind of things, which largely those policies and the way that, like the kolkhozes and the collectives and whatnot butted up against the realities of what Russian peasantry was like. That same kind of thing isn't necessarily present, especially if we're talking about an American context.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. And yeah, it's not empirical, but certainly there are more homes than there are people that need to be homed.
Yeah.
So there's already a surplus in that way. We already produce more food than we need to feed everyone globally, and we just allow most of it to go to waste and or be used for animal agriculture instead. And like you said, there's already an overproduction of shit that is unnecessary, that like even if there is a need to ramp up production in particular fields, the ability to shift production into something that's actually useful and not making fucking trinkets for Dollar Tree or whatever is probably likely possible without a significant upheaval of the current status quo.
Especially if the social relations of production are inverted. I mean, if people actually have a say in what they're making and they're doing it in the sense of maybe like a national identity or something, then that certainly will change as well, and it's not necessarily that it will change from the top down. Aside from that, even if you're thinking about defense, we wouldn't have to produce any fucking guns. There's more guns than people in this country for sure. So like I think that in a lot of facets our bases are covered. The same kind of policies that people criticize Stalin for at the utmost is not a requirement of communism. It's not ideological. It's something that's based off of material conditions, and like we're certainly living in a different material condition.
100%.
I don't know how we want to tackle through this fourth chapter.
My big takeaway from this chapter is all around the gulags.
Yeah.
Or the concentrationary universe. What do they call it?
Yes, something along those lines.
We've already brought up the thing about what is the purpose of a prison? What is the purpose of internment? And the very clear distinction that's drawn in this book between the gulags, which were not a fucking picnic, and concentration camps under Hitler.
Yeah.
Now, again, another thing that Losurdo is doing, kind of a motif that he sets here, is the idea of internment, often ethnically based internment, that was happening internationally at this same time. So it's not an excuse for any form, it's not a moral justification for internment by and large, but it is a recontextualization of the internment that was happening in the gulags in the USSR. But there are some pretty interesting stories about what the gulags were actually like. And I'll just throw out some stuff from 143. Mm-hmm. Well, here's a block quote from, is this from Applebaum?
It is from Anne Applebaum, yes.
Yeah, and it's funny because Losurdo says, indeed, the picture traced by the American historian could at times be mistaken for a product of Soviet propaganda if it did not come from a fierce anti-communist.
Yeah.
But the description of the gulags that we get there, prisoners were allowed to leave the prison freely. They organized morning gymnastics sessions, established an orchestra and a choir, created a club stocked with foreign magazines and a good library. According to pre-revolutionary era tradition, upon liberation, each prisoner left his books behind. And, further down, Losurdo kind of mediates that as an expectation of what the gulags were like. He says, it is true that the picture that the prison system presents over the same period of time is not homogeneous, and yet the above are not isolated cases. On the other hand, even if they were to be happy and fleeting islands, their existence would be in itself significant.
Yeah, I thought that the next block quote is the funniest thing possible. The list of Trot demands, they're literally political prisoners.
Yeah.
And they're like, expand the library, replenish it with periodicals printed in the USSR, and at least publications by Communist International. Systematically update the economic, political, and literature sections and supply literature in the languages of national minorities. Subscribe to at least one copy of each foreign newspaper. Allow for ordering of materials for courses by correspondence. Set up special cultural funds for this purpose. Such funds exist even in prisons for criminals. Allow delivery to the prison of all foreign editions permitted in the USSR, in particular foreign newspapers, including bourgeois newspapers. Allow book exchanges. Provide writing paper in the amount of no less than 10 notebooks per person each month. Can you imagine if an American, even a group of American prisoners was like, this is our demands?
Yeah.
How would that be received, man? And, and just to say that not all of those demands were met, but he does say that they were at least partially fulfilled.
Yeah. Number one, Trots are fucking nerds. They want books and paper so they can write. Number two, if the top of your demands is just to expand the library, your life is pretty fucking good. So there's that. I will note, in the next paragraph, it's noted that the Gulag leadership showed a certain religious tolerance and accommodated the request for a vegetarian diet made by members of a certain religious sect. So vegetarian gulags, shout out.
Yeah, your gulag should be vegan too. It's almost laughable. Top of 145. Strange as it may seem, the gulag was slowly bringing civilization, if that's what it can be called, to the remote wilderness,
Well, because the block quote that comes before that on the bottom of 144 is talking about the kulaks, which we'll get into when we get into the chapter with the Holodomor, certainly. But needing educated workers, those that ran the gulags, trained the ones that they had. Much of the ex-kulak workforce turned out to be illiterate or semi-literate, which caused enormous problems when dealing with projects of relative technical sophistication. The camp's administration, therefore, set up technical training schools. This comes back to that question that's begged, what is the purpose of internment? If you are being held in a gulag, the idea is that you would re-enter society, and the moment you re-enter society, you are expected to become a productive member of it. You are seen as just as the same as every other comrade. And folks that were being interned in these gulags were illiterate or semi-literate at best, and so they couldn't be trained in the gulags for labor. And so what did? They set up fucking schools to teach them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, not even, even beyond that. I mean, I know we just are literally working backwards on this paragraph here, but they built clinics, they built hospitals, they built all sorts of shit. And again, it is not that the gulag was a walk in the park, but most of the horror of the gulag you hear comes from the fact that they were being invaded by the Nazis.
Yes. Let's move forward to the paragraph. On the other hand, provoked by famine, by the pressures to increase the productivity of the prisoners, and through disorganization and often by the incompetence or rapacity of the local managers, tragedies were plentiful. This is coming because it's fucking wartime.
Yeah, very funny, by the way, that Losurdo cites the Black Book of Communism in here. But
he says supposed historians.
Right. Earlier, he talks about how during the encirclement of Leningrad, like 1 million people died in the fucking camps. And it's like they were encircled, Yeah, I'm sure that the Black Book of Communism counts those people as victims of communism.
Certainly.
And not victims of Nazis,
Yeah.
Fucking crazy stuff.
Yeah. But this is a good summation of it. We'll certainly keep going. But Losurdo writes on 145, clearly, it was not murderous intent that caused the horror. We are in the presence of one notable example of how badly things could go wrong through simple lack of planning.
Yeah. I mean, they were still trying to re-educate inmates at the time where Trotsky said it would be perfect to seize the golden fleece, Like, here's a statistic that I learned reading that Thurston book. If you want to talk about crime rates, right? At the height of the terror, tons of people were arrested for political reasons. I think it's something like 1 in 30. And that is a lot. Don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, first off, those were simply arrests. They weren't necessarily, not everyone went to the camps. Not everyone was executed or whatever. Simply arrested. And just putting that into even the context of like the U.S. prison system, 1 in 10 people have been to jail. So 1 in 30, is it really that crazy?
And the terror is certainly the exception in this case. Losurdo even writes, certainly a brutal turn took place in 1937.
Yeah.
As the Third Civil War flared up and increasingly threatening clouds gathered on the international horizon, a real or imagined fifth column became the object of an increasingly obsessive hunt. Not a justification for that sort of behavior, but it is certainly an explanation for where it came from.
Once again, we are not forgiving Stalin, we're simply contextualizing him. Yeah, I don't know. The more I learn about the Gulag, I'm just like, okay,
Yeah, same. I mean, I don't see it as...
It's not a good, it's just something.
Yeah, it is a thing.
Yeah, it happened. We can all agree on that. And this is going to be a next episode conversation too, because like so much of it is just pop culture mishmash. Like even reading the penal battalions talking about being thankful for having advanced weaponry, totally distinct from like the kind of portrayal of the Russian army during the Great Patriotic War in movies, Send 2 soldiers, one with a rifle, pick up the guy's rifle when he dies. I'm sure they had logistical challenges on the front, but to think about the state of the Soviet Union in movies compared to the actual state of the Soviet Union. I mean, even earlier when he's talking about their military readiness, they had produced more tanks in 1 year than the U.S. fucking put out in the first 4 years of the war or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Some crazy statistic like that. To say that they were unprepared is certainly misleading at best.
Yeah.
Across generations, through labor and shattered lives, with senseless exploitation.
For some reason, the USSR is singled out and the gulags are singled out as being particularly bad, while there are militarized labor camps all over internationally.
I mean, the one I want to talk about is certainly the one about African Americans in prison.
US South.
Because that is literally slave labor. Like, if we're talking about prison labor, that is a timely and topical example to bring up.
For sure.
Because, like, when he says that, just remember that African Americans could have been arrested for vagrancy.
Yeah, well, I'll just throw out a couple of those examples then, because they start on 158, and that leads us to the quotes about the United States.
Yeah.
Because in 158, two distinguished historians have respectfully defined the militarized labor camps of colonial India of 1877 and the concentration camps in which Libyans were imprisoned by liberal Italy as extermination camps. Even if one were to consider this formulaic emphatic, it is the racial logic and hierarchy that predominated in the Italian and Western colonial empire, which in any case more clearly resembled the concentrationary universe of the Third Reich. This is coming back from Losurdo's point that the gulags are not an ideological manifestation of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
They are a manifestation of the state of exception that the Soviet Union was living in, even when they were in this especially repressive time of the terror, because of everything that was happening.
Yeah.
So criticisms you can cast against the gulags, though legitimate, are not that they are ideological forced labor camps made in the image of or similar to the concentration camps of Hitler.
Right.
Those camps that are ideologically similar to and made in the image of the concentration camps of Hitler are like the extermination camps run by Italy and India. He also talks about death camps in Canada. The Truth Commission into Genocide in Canada speaks of death camps of men, women, and children being deliberately killed, of a system whose aim was to destroy most native peoples by disease, relocation, and outright murder. The fact remains that we come across practices that are identical or similar to those in force in the Third Reich and implemented on the basis of an ideology once again similar to that which presided over the construction of Hitler's racial state.
Right. It was not the Gulag that inspired Hitler's concentration camps. It was
the United
America.
States.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He points out rail construction on 159 in the U.S. between 1877 and 1880. In the course of the construction of the railroad lines at Greenwood and Augusta, nearly 45% of the forced laborers employed there died, and these were young black men in the prime of their lives. And like you said, a crime as simple as vagrancy would mean imprisonment, and then you get forced labor until their death.
I mean, God, in the first 2 years that Alabama leased its prisoners, nearly 20% of them died. To compare that to the entirety of the Gulag system, essentially, he says that there's a 4.8% of the average camp population. And he even inflates that. He says that that's probably conservative. That statistic doesn't include the Goldfield camps. It also doesn't take into account the characteristic underestimates in the reports of health section. So even if we were to raise that significantly, it seems difficult to reach the mortality rate that raged on the African American prisoners just seen above.
Yep.
And that's damning. Damning.
Yeah. I would just, another quote on 160 to really nail that point home. In the U.S. South, black convicts suffered horrific living and working conditions and died en masse during a period of peace. The state of exception played no role, and also any productivist concern played a marginal or entirely non-existent role. Everyone knows that America's treatment of Native Americans and African Americans was the blueprint on which Hitler built his ethno-state.
Yeah. I even love that quote at the top of 160. The health sections of camps feared being accused of negligence and untimeliness in admitting the sick. Camps could be inspected at any time. Judging from the mortality rate of the semi-slaves rented out, it does not appear that a similar threat loomed over American entrepreneurs who grew rich from building the Greenwood and Augusta railroad lines or from other enterprises.
Yep. And that's, like, your point about it still being relevant, still being prescient, is that forced labor still exists. Mass incarceration exists. So those incarcerated can be exploited by capitalists. Their labor can be stolen.
Right. Slavery is still allowed in the U.S. It absolutely is. In the Constitution.
Yep.
Man. Okay, he does talk about the affirmative action empire in the next section.
I would point out, I want to read this quote from 164 just
Yeah.
because say what you want, criticize the USSR if you would like to. That's fine. They are not above criticism. But this line here, I think, is relevant. He's talking about Nazi concentration camps and the Germanization of the indigenous people. Yeah, I'm just going to read the line. Fuck it. And such a project, speaking of Nazis and Germany's Holocaust, and such a project would have devoured an even more immense mass of victims had it not been countered by an opposing project based on the recognition of not only the existential, but also the cultural and national rights of indigenous peoples.
Oh, yeah. Fucking Fourth Reich ass world we live in.
On that note, let's jump to the cavalcade of quotes.
Yeah. Just a really funny note on page 27. This is talking about Stalin's night and day devotion to the war effort. He says that, having been informed of the fact that they had run out of cigarettes, thanks also to his ability to handle a Herculean workload, he made time during the Battle of Stalingrad to telephone Akaki Megaladze, party boss of Abkhazia, where tobacco was grown. Our soldiers have nothing to smoke. Tobacco is absolutely necessary at the front.
Yeah.
So two things. One, it's always funny that tobacco is part of the military logistical operation.
Mm-hmm.
But secondly, during the fucking Battle of Stalingrad,
I know,
okay,
right?
they were like seriously worried about being overrun, and he's like, "I need smokes for my boys."
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. I'll jump forward to 51. Maybe I should have mentioned this when you were talking about the material equality under Marxism, but we get this quote about Marxist equality that I really liked. Stalin insisted it is time that we understood that Marxism is an enemy of equalization. The equality produced by socialism consists in the elimination of class exploitation, certainly not in the imposition of uniformity and co-optation, which is the ideal to which religious primitivism aspires. I think that, you've probably seen that SpongeBob meme or whatever where it's like description of communism, actual capitalism. Yeah. But like this idea of communism as being like a soulless, gray, bleak, bland, uniform kind of idea is just so stupid. I don't even know where it comes from.
Fucking straight propaganda, man.
Yeah. I would blame Orwell for it mostly.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway.
On 48, I had saved this one for later, for the cavalcade, but in 1921 to 22, literally tens of thousands of Bolshevik workers tore up their membership cards and discussed with the NEP. They dubbed it the new exploitation of the proletariat. Very funny.
Yeah. There's just this great line on 55. Stalin felt the need to warn against the leftist chatter current among a section of our functionaries to the effect that Soviet trade is a superseded stage, that it is necessary to organize the direct exchange of products, that money will soon be abolished. Those who thus argue do not realize that their supercilious attitude towards Soviet trade is not an expression of Bolshevik views, but rather the views of the impoverished aristocrats who are full of ambition, but lack ammunition. That's a fucking bar.
Yeah. Very good. It's very much like the wheel is spinning but the hamster's dead. Literally at the top of that page, 57.
Okay.
Did I just have this page open in my hand?
You had
Yes,
it open.
I
It was
did.
the next page, yeah.
57. Just kind of talking about that back and forth between that kind of abstract universalism of people like Kollontai and then the more concrete reality. Here it's embodied by Kaganovich, where he says that while fully adhering to the principle of women's liberation, he vehemently lashed out against extremist positions. Sapsevic, one of the leftist planners, had even proposed to suppress any space of communal living between husband and wife other than small bedroom. He had advanced the idea of a large beehive buildings of 2,000 people of all facilities in common to stimulate the community spirit and suppress the institution of bourgeois family. And honestly, all I can say is beast mode, I'm afraid. Like, yeah, let me fucking, 2,000 people in a fucking building. That'd be sick as hell. Whatever, sure, I'm all for it.
I have a surprising agreement with Trotsky on 65, because we get this quote from The Revolution Betrayed, actually, where Trotsky writes, "Every revolutionary party finds its chief support in the younger generation of the rising class. Political decay expresses itself in a loss of ability to attract the youth under one's banner." I actually think he's right on that. So there you go. If you're a Trotskyist and you somehow still made it this far into this show and this episode, I agree with Trotsky on that.
There you go. Yeah. He says that that's part of the failure of the Mensheviks is that the Bolsheviks had the power of the youth, man. So just to give more credence to the actual reality of a conspiracy, even in the second half of 1937, information reached Czechoslovak President Edward Bernays concerning secret negotiations in progress between the Third Reich and the anti-Stalin clique in the USSR. Okay, the president of Czechoslovakia was like, there's a real enough threat for me to warn Stalin about this. I think that's a pretty real threat. Okay, here's a crazy one on 134. Very early on, I expressed that Stalin was seeking some kind of alliance after World War II, and very immediately we fucking shat all over him.
Oh, yeah.
I guess this actually starts on 133. A great future for the grand alliance of anti-fascists, and even tried to prevent the outbreak of the Cold War. That's very fucking true. I mean, this is ideologically bewildering on page 133.
Yeah.
This is where he talks about socialism under the English king, but you can see Stalin's steps to prevent the Cold War and these kinds of things. In Poland, there's no dictatorship of the proletariat, and you don't need it. Must Poland follow the path of introducing the dictatorship of the proletariat? No, it doesn't have to. It's not necessary. It's possible to achieve socialism in a new way, without the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's bonkers. That's fucking bonkers,
Way
Stalin.
off.
You know, but likewise in Germany, up until the fucking merger of the French, British, and American zones into the FDR, the FRD, there we go, pardon me, Roosevelt, and the creation of the Deutschmark, right? Stalin prevented the Sovietization of East Germany because he wanted the creation of a unified Germany. That's a fucking fact. Okay, they were caught off guard by the moves of the West to unite and to create a separate second Germany aside from East Germany. He wanted a single, unified, and neutral Germany, right? It is the actions of the West that set the stage for the Cold War there. Even to follow that up, he does say to Tito, in fact, not to just any Yugoslav foreign minister, but he says that to Tito, in our times, socialism is possible even under the English monarchy. Yes, socialism is possible even under an English king. What the fuck, dude? You know, and I will thanks to Losurdo for kind of clarifying there. To formulate the hypothesis of socialism under an English king was to question in some way, if not the monopolistic concentration of power in the hands of the party, at any rate the methods of terrorist dictatorship and autocracy. You know, and I think that there's something there.
That's pretty kind.
Yeah, I agree. It is pretty kind.
Yeah, we'll see how we take that at the latter chapters. So, I mean, we won't go through the whole spiel since we haven't finished the book yet, but are there any questions that are on the top of your mind at this stage in the reading?
Honestly, no. This was quite affirming to read, you know. Not that we read it for affirmation, but I'm enjoying it so far. Maybe I will have some questions in the second section, but I think as of right now, I'm feeling pretty good.
Okay. Yeah, I have a couple. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to read this is specifically to get more context around the Holodomor, which is coming in the next section. So it's not really fair to say that's still a standing question, but it didn't really come up at all in the first chapters.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious to see how that comes up. Questions that were raised from this reading. It's clear to me that I don't know anything about the history of Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia specifically, but they get mentioned a couple of times in these first chapters, and I don't know what I should know or feel about that. The context of it is unclear to me. It's just one of those cases where the question is, what do I need to know about Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia to understand the context of this book?
I don't know if there's really that much, honestly. Maybe in the next section.
Yeah, maybe it'll come up in this section too, but I mean, like, it's quite evident that there was antagonism with Czechoslovakia that I don't really understand, and there was antagonism with Yugoslavia, so much so that Yugoslavia was imprisoning Stalinists, so to speak. So,
but yeah, there's a split between Tito and Stalin in 1948, and it has to do largely with the stance of the communists post-World War II. In the Balkans, in fact, there was originally planned a united socialist Balkan Federation, and Tito, I believe, wanted Yugoslavia to include also Bulgaria and Romania, and there was a falling out. And then there was some personal beef also. I know that Stalin sent numerous assassins after Tito, to the point where Tito had to say, "Stop sending assassins or I will send one assassin," which is so fucking good.
That's baller.
That's based as hell. Yeah. So, yeah, there is some stuff there. Czechoslovakia, I have no fucking clue, other than the fact that it was a new state. You know, it was a brand new creation. That even gets further along into, like, 1968 and stuff. I mean, we didn't mention it all, but very funny for Khrushchev to, in 1954, talk about all of the shit that Stalin did as an authoritarian dictator, and then 2 years later roll the fucking tanks into Hungary. All other feelings aside, if you want to talk about the original sin of Stalin, it's like, buddy, you carried it right along with you.
Yeah, for sure.
So...
But that's it. So we'll see if the next section answers those questions for me.
Yeah, I hope so. I was surprised not to see anything about the Holodomor so far, especially because it seemed that the first section of this was going to be very much focused on the history.
Yeah.
And we did get a lot. I mean, we did get a lot, but I'm excited to read the second half.
Yeah, same.
So
In the meantime, if you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, recommendations for further reading, especially around, the history that we're exploring in the Losurdo, feel free to reach out to us, leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
yeah, especially if you have another supplemental text that you think would be really key for contextualizing this kind of stuff, I particularly would be super interested in that.
The other one I see bandied about a lot is Another View of Stalin.
Yeah.
Very similar kind of thing.
Yeah.
But
We'll see you next time. Don't get left unread.
that's right.
See ya.
Bye.